He heads up the Measuring Broadband America program, which he's going to tell us about today. So we're very, very fortunate to hear from Walt today about the program. And I'll say one more thing about that. I mentioned early this morning, but I think it bears repeating. I don't think we'd be in this room doing this today if it weren't for this program. Certainly, I wouldn't be continuing to work on this problem. When I saw this program kick off, I realized that a very small, well, what I thought was a small academic question about how to measure speeds, et cetera, then I think I came to a meeting that Walt hosted in DC, an open meeting of the program back in 2010, and I think I might have been the only engineer in the room. And I realized there's something going on here in this area. Something very important is happening. And we're about to have a lot of very important discussions, and that's been going on certainly over the last 4 or 5 years. And Walt deserves a lot of credit for that. He also has had a lot of influence on me in terms of the types of problems that, as a networking researcher, I've chosen to dig into, both with the MBA data and otherwise. So he's been a great influence also to the research community. But without further ado, I will thank Walt for coming and also turn it over to him for the rest of the lunchtime talk.
All right. Thank you, Nick. By the way, to complete the cycle, I was just telling Nick a moment ago that while he was giving his presentation on interconnection, gateway interconnection, one of the ISPs I worked with actually forwarded me the link. So almost as soon as it was put up, I had one of the stakeholders said, "You got to take a look at this paper." So let me get. Here we go. All right. I'm going to be talking very briefly about a program that, as Nick said, I started, he started, and a whole bunch of other people started about in 2010. And like a lot of things that get started in life, where we started is not where we wound up. And in fact, to be honest, I didn't even start the program. I was volunteered by my boss to help another bureau help out. And as I explained to him, when we looked around, everybody else was gone, literally. And we were stuck owning the project. But we started something called Measuring Broadband America, simply because about a couple of years after I joined the agency, Chairman Janikowski, Julius Janikowski, came in, and the agency was really just recognizing the impact of broadband. I came in at an interesting time. A few years before Janikowski came in, broadband was looked at as a magical thing that was somehow separate from communications infrastructure. And people talked about apps. It was all about apps when I came in, and not a lot of understanding of the profound changes that were just about to occur. And when Chairman Janikowski came in, he focused on developing a plan for broadband and recognized that broadband was going to be a profound change in communications infrastructure. And that was recognized belatedly by the FCC, and since at one time I worked for one of the carriers, Verizon, I can tell you that even among the telephone companies, the impact of broadband was recognized only really in the late 90s. So it's like anything else. There's a quote I remember from Andy Grove, who was CEO of Intel, about how he was cycling through the hills of California, and he realized the profundity of the internet. He said he was blindsided by the internet, which had just celebrated its 20th anniversary at that time. And I always thought, gee, it's strange to be blindsided by something that's been evolving for 20 years. It's like saying you were sideswiped by an iceberg. Okay, but we started this program because FCC started to recognize the importance of broadband. I'm not going to belabor these points. Most recently, we've had the Open Internet Order, and we've tried to look at what we should be measuring in the context of the Open Internet Order and transparency. By the way, the last order, the 2015 order, coined the term Broadband Internet Access Provider, which has the acronym of BIAS, and I'm sure that was unintended. but unfortunately, that's what the ISPs are stuck with. As I said, the FCC issued a national broadband plan. It's still up on our website. And in fact, I've done a lot of strategic plans in my life. This one is a fairly good plan, and large elements have been implemented or at least influenced the work of the FCC. As part of that plan, we initiated a program to provide accurate data on fixed broadband to the home. That was the goal that we set. How we did it is was evolutionary. And I'll give the ISPs credit. They came into us and said they wanted to participate. In fact, demanded that they participate in the program. So we received the cooperation of major ISPs supporting 85% of consumers in the United States. Surprisingly, that's only 13 to 15 ISPs. And we've looked at this program and how we could evolve it or scale it. And you're left with the the conundrum that 13 to 15 ISPs support 85% of the nation, and then literally 3,000 ISPs support the rest of the nation. So a program that we can handle 13 to 15 ISPs is actually not ideal to deal with 3,000 ISPs, and we're still looking at that as an issue. And in 2014, we initiated coverage of mobile broadband performance. For economic reasons, we decided to use a crowdsourcing approach. And we collected data that includes performance data, cell tower data, cell coverage data, and phone data. So, and we're just about to, this year actually, we're just about to make that an open program. With the fixed program, we used a Nielsen type approach. We've actually instrumented about 6,000 homes in the US with a programmable router that does autonomous testing. We produce an annual report based upon the data we collect. And we continually collect data from these homes, although the report we issue is based on a test period of September, October. We originally picked that period because it seemed to be unexceptional. We later found out it turned out to be the iOS release date, and the early impact of that was profound. To complement Apple, they are getting better at making sure that iOS doesn't disrupt the internet. This last year, we noticed a much less of an impact from that. We also noted football games that occurred during the period, but there's probably no unexceptional month. This is the best we could do. And all data that we collect is available on the website. So it's a fully open data program. The data we use in our report, we publish, and it's used by academics and other policymakers in terms of looking at what's going on the internet. Something we did much more recently is because we only use 2 months worth of data, although we collect whenever, there's never an idle period, so these boxes are running 24/7, 7 days a week throughout the year, but we only need data from September, October, and about 3 years ago, we came up with the idea that to the extent that researchers could use our infrastructure, we would make that infrastructure available. We've involved Georgia Tech, that was Nick Feemster at the time, with his WTF project, and I apologize to Nick for that because while he used our network, he was actually our test case. So we understood what we could do with our infrastructure, and unfortunately for Nick, what we could not do with our infrastructure, and there was a lot of lessons learned from working with him. We're providing latency data to CITP, I never get the name right, focused on some of their work on congestion management, and we're just about to do some work again with Casey Claffey from CITP in terms of carrier grade NAT studies that she's pursuing. With the fixed program, we've been evolving the speeds. We're finding that, especially with DOCSIS 3, that the speeds are increasing on average for the consumer about 50% a year. And we're challenged by these higher rates. Every time we've gone to a quanta above where we've been in the past, something breaks in our measurement infrastructure. So last year, if you read our report, we had some issues with some of the speeds that we were running and the data rates that we were running. We hope this year to go to a gigabit in terms of a testing capability. We've identified a router that's capable of supporting a gigabit per second, and we're going to be using in our program. But we have an interest in shaping the program to better support research. So we've starting to expand our relationships with researchers that are opportunistic. We're not trying to push our infrastructure, but to the extent that we can use what we've invested in to support research activities that are interesting to us, we're trying to do that to the best we can. The program has had a lot of different impacts. For one thing, for the first 3 years of the program, service actually improved among the ISPs in 2 ways. The ratio of advertised to delivered speed increased. So the consumer got much closer to what they were being promised. The other thing we noticed is that the spread between the best and the worst diminished. And that lasted for a period of 3 years. I think we're at a stasis point right now. Most especially the cable and fiber carriers, are delivering 100% or better of what they're advertising. And I think they're at their operational limits in terms of what further improvements we can see. So we don't expect a lot more increase in that. Working with the ISPs has provided a secondary benefit in that we have a lot more understanding now of the functioning and operating of the internet than when we started this program. And I'd also argue there's a level of trust in terms of what we're being told. The normal way the FCC operates, and a lot of government agencies operate, and I'm not the first to say this, but a company will come in with a high-priced lawyer and they'll lie to you for a full solid hour. I mentioned the Cogent Netflix. We had a dozen companies come in arguing the exact opposite of what the company before was arguing. And we're not seeing that where we have a chance to have these long endurance projects working with industry, and that was part of Janikowski's plan, is to partner with industry. So we've gotten a strong secondary benefit, is that we've increased our understanding of the way the internet operates and some of the challenges that the ISPs face in making it operate efficiently. And the other thing we've done is that this program began as a snapshot program. We were trying to see if companies were delivering what they promised. There was some work going on in Europe that suggested that companies weren't delivering what they promised. There was a company here in the US that was claiming that the ISPs were delivering only half the speeds that they were promised. So the initial program was take a snapshot, but as we've evolved the program, it's provided a baseline for progress for the internet. And increasingly the information that we get is integrated into other FCC programs. Another change that we started to see, when we started this program, nobody was video streaming Netflix. And what was important to us at the beginning of the program was averages, average speed, average latency, average packet loss. If you're watching a movie, video streaming a movie, the consistency of the service becomes very important to you. So we've taken the same measurements, but we're starting to analyze those measurements now in terms of the consistency of the service over a period of time. And that's increasingly important where you have these long duration services. You can have an average rate of 100 megabits, but if you have 10 stutters while watching a movie, you're not going to be happy. The other thing we started to do is recognizing the importance of video streaming service, and this was actually partly stimulated by the Cogent, Netflix, and I don't want to, by the way, when I use terms like Cogent and Netflix, I'm not pointing a finger, but I'm at a loss to otherwise identify the situation. But we actually started a program characterizing video streaming performance. We're working currently with Netflix, Hulu, and YouTube, and we'll probably be publishing some data this year on that. But the focus was trying to understand, since video streaming is now over half the traffic on the network, we saw an opportunity to work with these companies. And these companies represent probably about 70% of that video traffic, of trying to better characterize internet. Interconnection points are another area we're focused on. We're hoping work going on between MIT and CITP will provide some opportunities for maybe a new set of measurements that we could introduce. We're supporting some of their research in terms of making our data available to them in different ways that they've requested. And we're open to, I was very interested in Nick's proposal. In fact, what I'd like to emphasize is that we're looking to accumulate data. It's not necessarily data that we have to accumulate ourselves or produce ourselves. So we're looking for any way that we can get credible, unrestricted data into the commission. And unrestricted is important. There are secondary sources of data. There are commercial companies that produce data. Anybody who's gone down that road knows that when you buy data, it also comes with a bunch of restrictions on what you can and can't do with it, and that's not too useful for the commission's purpose. Another thing that we've done, and again, we're trying to evolve the program, there's an advisory group called the FCC Technological Advisory Council. It's a group of about 45 people representing a broad swath of industry. Last year actually, they took up the whole issue of next generation internet, and out of that came up with a recommendation that we needed to expand our MBA program. And we're working with them this year on what explicit recommendations that might entail. We started with a fixed program, although we wanted to focus on mobile as well. We had some issues. We approached a number of companies in 2010 talking about mobile measurements. We did not get a lot of support. We went back a few years later and basically said, we think we can do this without your cooperation, but we'd like your cooperation. And we got the 4 largest wireless carriers to start working with us using a crowdsourced approach. It's an open methodology we developed with industry. We've made our clients available on GitHub as open source for inspection. We don't collect any personally identifiable information. We don't have any ads on our software, and there's no commercial intent for use of the software. So we basically are collecting data in a non-commercial way, subject to privacy policy. We will make that data available. And we've actually spent 2 years demonstrating or verifying the validity of the data we've collected and examining how best to present it. And I will say that in the beginning of the program, I think we were rather naive because we thought mobile was a increment to fixed data, and mobile has a whole set of challenges in terms of privacy and statistics that we just don't encounter in the fixed environment. We have 2 clients that we support, Android, which were released in mid-November 2013. It's available at Google Play. We spent a lot of time and a lot of expertise coming up with a name for the client, and we call it the FCC speed test. Okay, and we're going to trademark that. I think we're going to trademark that name. The iPhone was released in February 2014, and I emphasize for a very short time we were the 4th most popular app in the store. I think we're the only government agency to actually crack the top 10. I wish I was joking. I think we're the only government agency to have an app in the top 10. I know no other app that can claim that. And there are differences between Android and the iPhone. We love both companies, but the Android platform gives us a lot more data. And also, importantly for us, it allows us to schedule tests automatically. The iPhone, you have to manually initiate the test. By the way, anybody in the room who hasn't downloaded our app, because we're trying to build up a user base, please download it. But the iPhone has to be manually initiated. There are some issues associated with doing that. My favorite all-time comment, by the way, was a user who basically posted a comment on, this was on the Google app, but it's the same app, who rated a very useful app, and you have to live in the government web environment to really appreciate this, and said surprisingly not ugly. Okay, so that's a damning combination of government websites. You have to enlist volunteers for crowdsourcing. What we found, it's event-oriented. Every news article or blog post gets you subscribers, but only for about 10 days. There's a really sharp damp-out period. After 10 days, you're forgotten about. And you need an evolving outreach program to keep reinforcing programs and apps. Okay, and because of issues of verifying the statistical validity of the data, we actually haven't talked about this app for 2 years. We still have tens of thousands of users, but we really have not been able to talk about it publicly. Although the last 2 competitive wireless reports put out by the Wireless Bureau, which is another bureau within the FCC, have included our data among other data sets that they've cited. So we were happy to see that, and they were actually very instrumental in helping us demonstrate the statistical validity of the data. We're going to begin this year. We're going to be talking about this program more this year, and predominantly to get more volunteers into the program. What we found, by the way, is mobile data is very complex. We did a lot of analysis of data in comparison to other available data sets. And what we found is that at sufficient levels of aggregation, you meet valid statistical criteria. All the data sets seem to converge. So what we found is that when you get up to very high levels of aggregation, something like a cellular market area, which is like a major metro area within a major metro area, you meet all the statistical criteria that you want to establish in terms of probability of error or other statistical checks. The other reality, and we've looked at this in the context of other approaches, at sufficient levels of disaggregation, all the weaknesses come home to you. Crowdsourcing and drive testing both are dependent upon limited sample sets as you increase the resolution. So the conundrum of the wireless is you get huge data sets. People talk about crowdsourcing, you instantly think, well, you have a lot of data that you can analyze. And that's true when you aggregate the data. But correspondingly, you have very sparse data sets when the data is disaggregated. Drive testing, for example, is typically done no more than twice a year. You're measuring very specific points on a street. With crowdsourcing, you have a few consumers that are going to become a proxy for you at a street level. And street level measurements mean what to the average consumer? When you disaggregate the data, there is no average consumer. Just because I have an average number, and you can always calculate an average number at a street level, might mean nothing to you within your home environment or across the street. So the how to present the data became a very challenging problem to us. And we had a lot of industry concerns. When we started the FIX program, I think industry was very concerned about what the FCC would say, and we were able to deal with that. We were totally unprepared for industry concerns on the wireless. Mobile is a competitive environment and competition is fierce. Government commenting on performance is perceived as very threatening. And it's always been ironic to me, if anybody who watches a TV ad will note that not only do we have 4 major carriers, but each of those carriers has the best network in the nation. And there's only 2 conclusions, okay? Either all 4 networks are identical, or at least one of them is not telling the truth, okay? So we had vigorous pushback from some participants in the program, basically asking us to question the data. And to be fair to them, some of their challenges were valid. And one of the things, when we started with this program, we thought mobile was a great opportunity to map things. And we actually had a very credible mapping program underway at the FCC to present the data. The concern was, is what I said earlier, the maps allow you to go to a degree of resolution where the data becomes meaningless. Another concern we had in mobile data, which is a large and growing concern for this population, is the whole issue of privacy. Over the last several years, NTIA and FTC have led industry discussions in this area. Unfortunately, those discussions have not reached any clear resolution to the benefit of the consumer. We're still in the early stages of discussion on a whole host of privacy issues. And if you read any terms and conditions, okay, the terms and conditions are to protect the company. Okay, anybody who has clicked on any, and I don't want to pick on any names in the room, but anybody who has agreed to terms and conditions have given up rights to privacy and probably rights to their firstborn child. It's got nothing to do with protecting you. When we started this program, we actually sat down with the wireless carriers, with the FTC, and our own general counsel to sit down and work out a privacy policy for our program. Our goal was to protect the consumer. That's the only goal we had. And part of that was to seek only necessary data supporting understanding of broadband services and broadband network. We know nothing about what the consumer is doing with the phone. We know a lot about the bits and bytes that are passing through the phone in terms of rates and network characteristics. But we have run away from anything to do with actual usage of the phone in terms of applications. We're committed to an open data release subject to third-party review for privacy compliance. We expect this year to be able to release some data associated with the program, and we're starting to stage the data now for third-party review. The handset is fully anonymized. This led to changes in our initial design strategies, and we wound up with a handset that we can't even tell how many handsets are out there. So we have no way to track an individual handset. By the way, that doesn't fully guarantee any privacy issues, but we started out with a fully anonymous handset. And when we did testing with the wireless carriers, we actually had to ask the carriers, how many people did you give this out to? How many people are currently testing the program? We've done analysis of data with outside parties. We're going to obfuscate the data when required for public release. And this is a difference from our fixed program. Our fixed program will release the actual data. What we said from the beginning is we'll release the data subject to conformance with our privacy policy, which means we will probably aggregate time periods and also aggregate other data or do other things necessary to transform the data so that it still comports with our report but doesn't identify individuals, or at least minimizes the risk to an acceptable level. We see this, by the way, as a growing problem. One of the things we stumbled over in the last couple of years is lots and lots of people are collecting mobile data. There's no consistent policies. There's no standardized policies across the nation to do this. And we were offered data sets, but they entangle you. So one of the, if you have a privacy policy, you have to be careful that the data that you import is conformant with that policy. So and our goal has been to start a discussion on common privacy policies for collection of mobile data. That's going to take a long time, but we think it's important that there be standards in this area. Our program began very serendipitously, as I mentioned, initially focused on producing a snapshot. We are evolving now towards baseline studies, incorporations of critical measurements and network nodes. We're increasingly aligning the program with open internet goals. And in fact, elements of our program have been offered as a safe harbor, for example, for fixed broadband. So if you want to meet the transparency requirements of the open internet, you can participate in our program, and that's fulfillment in terms of safe harbor. And we remain open for guidance on how best to evolve. We've increased our discussions with a lot of other companies, a lot of researchers. We're very open to how we can best meet the needs of an evolving internet. We'd like to be a repository for data that describes the health and growth of the internet and maintain that as an open data policy. All right, thank you.
We definitely have time for questions.
You mentioned about privacy. What about the relation between privacy and big data? That, I guess, being for healthcare, for example. So I'd like to know, is there some future plan for collecting in the form of big data, for example, for healthcare and other applications?
Well, we don't deal with healthcare data. We deal with network data. But we are still concerned that to the extent we collect, for example, geolocation data. So we collect a lat long, which we won't release. But there's a number of papers out there showing that you can basically de-identify data if you have enough of it, if you don't take specific precautions. So, and if you know where somebody went during the course of a day, you know a lot about a person. So we're taking, we're basically going to have to aggregate our data. For example, we will not release a lat long. We might release, well, if we're aggregating right now to a cellular market area, the lat long or the geolocation is a cellular market area, which is a pretty broad area. Time frames, we're not going to give precise timestamps. Most likely will basically, right now our initial report's focused on yearly quarters, so the timestamp would be a quarter of a year. So one approach we're taking is simply just aggregate the data to a level at which you can do what's sometimes called crowd hiding. But we are taking a step of having an independent review of our privacy policies, and the data that we release will be conformant with that independent review. Any other questions? Yes.
Michael Elling, IVP Capital. You had mentioned removing any notion of applications from the data. Ericsson coined a term, I think 2 or 3 years ago. They called it app coverage, meaning when you look at the performance of a cellular network, the farther you get out to the edge boundary of the coverage footprint of that tower or cell, the differences in degradation vary dramatically by application.
Yes.
So SMS will get through, but video will jitter and buffer. So I'm wondering why you chose to dissociate the application. Wouldn't that be a valid measurement?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things we'd like to know. Okay, it's a question of we're a government agency. There's a guy named Snowden. And we wanted to make clear that we were not spying on people. So we restricted ourselves, for better or for worse, we restricted ourselves to just collecting network data. So the only thing we collect information such as speed, latency, and loss. We collect the handset type, we collect the operating system running on it, we collect the version of the operating system running on it, we collect cell tower ID, we collect a lat long associated with location, although we're very fearful of that. But we don't go above that. So we don't go to what apps, we don't want to know what apps people are running. We felt that was too intrusive. Other people are studying that. We'd rather just run away from it as a problem, frankly. Yes?
You mentioned in the fixed line program the long tail of ISPs, like the sort of last 15%.
Yes, yes.
Did I hear 3,000 correctly?
Yes, it's still, I actually rounded. It's not precisely 3,000,
Okay,
but yes.
that's a lot. I was wondering what if there's any sort of patterns in there as far as like technologies, or are these sort of rural DSL? Or is
They're mostly rural DSLs. We have very little knowledge of them. Actually, one of our hopes is that we think some of this measurement software is going to be embedded in the routers directly, which would give us some ability to survey. The other thing that gives us some hope is that there's something called Connect America Fund, and Connect America Fund has an auditing requirement, and one of the options in that auditing requirement is to use our program. So we're starting to see a door open up into, that will allow us to peek into the rural area, but I'd say one of the failures of this program has been that we've had to ignore the rural area. You know, it's 15% of the population, but it's a 15% of the population that still is an important part of this country, but they happen to live structurally in areas that are very difficult for us to deal with. You can't ask any questions.
It's a good one. So one of the questions that I have is that, you know, MLab gets approached on this question, especially in developing countries, of the performance of mobile networks versus fixed line, as in order to especially promote the idea that that in places where infrastructure is difficult to maintain, mobile broadband is a competitive alternative. It even, I think, came up as a question on our panel as to whether mobile will be able to. What I think is interesting to this is that you are starting to structurally measure the viability of mobile broadband as a replacement for fixed line, or as a competitor, rather. Is your intention to move towards comparable measurement methodologies? And let's say in the short term, what are some of the struggles that you're running up against in collecting mobile measurements through crowdsourced data that might be comparable or perceived by the public as comparable to something like SAMNOS, which is a lot more segmented and rigid, and maybe you even think is probably more reliable?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to toss off the comparability because that's a statistical issue. Our goal this year is fairly modest. Okay, we've gotten a green light to release data, and we think if we release it, we're over a hump in terms of being able to talk about the program. So we haven't tried to take on the world. Regarding whether or not wireless is a replacement for fixed, there's probably two answers on that. We're starting to see in the rural areas, which we don't reach with the fixed program, but we're starting to see in rural areas an emphasis on fixed wireless. So some of the carriers are proposing that they support broadband to the home in rural areas with a fixed wireless solution. Whether or not we can track that in our program, I don't know yet, but it's something we're going to be looking at. But that's probably, my guess is that's probably going to be a weak solution in terms of if you have an opportunity to use cable or fiber, fixed wireless in rural is going to be a third alternative. Another interesting option we're starting to see developed is 5G, which is not, 5G, we're talking about distances that are 300 meters. So you're not going to be using that as a rural technology, but if you look at the speeds that you can get out of 5G, that may be a substitute. But that will go into urban areas, and that's another area we're going to take a hard look at. But there's two different opportunities for wireless as a substitution. One where it's better than no option, and the other where it's probably going to be directly competitive with cable and fiber solutions. Okay?
I'll ask another question. So you mentioned, I think there was a GitHub link to your mobile.
Yes.
Just a question about that, because I think we've seen some things on our own mobile test too that are very strange. When we look at we have a mobile measurement tool as well. It's open source, and you look at the Google Play developer console, you see a certain number of installs. Then we're actually getting measurements from a lot more, it would seem. Not quite sure what's going on there, but one theory is that people are downloading the source code, compiling the APK, and installing it. And I'm wondering, I mean, on one hand, the open source is a good thing. Thank you. On the other hand, for a program like yours, where you're in the position that you are, is there a concern that people are downloading the source code, maybe doing something to it, compiling the APK?
That's an interesting question. I really have to think about.
Okay.
I have no immediate answer for that, but you will prompt a thought on my part. What we did notice when we downloaded it, by the way, is our first data came from China.
We had a similar thing. We saw a very similar thing where we had thousands of users in Iran.
Yes.
Which is very strange because...
Well, our hope was that they downloaded it and just didn't hack us.
Right, exactly.
So there are some state efforts that are trying to do, particularly in the wireless space, connectivity projects, measurements, particularly in California, the California PUC.
Yes, we're aware of that.
Are you doing any work to try to coordinate this?
We tried. First of all, we're a short-staffed. If I told you the number of people that are on this project, I'd be very embarrassed. We're short-staffed. We actually have talked to the California people. Coordination is something we've thought about, talked about. I just don't think we have the momentum right now to do it, frankly. I'd be happy. The privacy, I would love to see, if I was going to pick anything that I'd like to see a policy on, it's a national policy on mobile broadband privacy. The fact that there are duplicate programs out there or programs that are doing different, it's not as important to me. But if I was going to spend my time, effort, and capital on coordinating, it would be if there was a realistic opportunity to get a national policy on privacy.
How much data do you think is good enough to really extrapolate and get a pretty good picture of all over the U.S.? A second facet of that question is, if you guys are already working with folks like Google and other big players, if they have certain end host measuring points using web servers, right? Just based on clients coming to a server, you can measure so much about a client that doing crowdsourcing and forcing people to download an app may not be essential to collect the type of data that you're trying to collect. Like getting 10,000 users is a lot of effort for crowdsourcing, and
Actually, getting 10,000 users is one blog post, is what we found. So it's not. There seems to be a high philanthropic, and I find this amazing since we're a government agency, but there's a large number of people, large in the sense of tens of thousands, maybe not large in the sense of population of the United States, that are interested in contributing data. So we can get 10,000 with a single blog post. Of course, it has to be an interesting blog post, but what we've noticed is that we will get 10,000 people just if we get a good placement. That's trivial. In terms of, I'm not quite sure I understood your question that you don't need a server.
If you put a server, you probably don't need to put so much on the client, right? If you're observing, and if you can install a crazy web page with JavaScript and being able to do a lot of browser level measurements, that you can extract information about a client from a server.
The issue with mobile is you've got to place, however you do it, you have to place a measurement point at an arbitrary place within the footprint of the wireless service provider. So the crowdsourcing gives us that arbitrary point. The other classical way of doing it, and each has its strengths and weaknesses, is you build up what they call drive testing. You deterministically pick points on a grid or some map that you're going to survey at some periodic basis, and you send somebody out to that location. But in both cases, you need somebody. In fact, when you think about it, crowdsourcing and drive testing are really the same approach. One uses a deterministic set of nodes to measure. The other one uses a random set of nodes to measure. But it really comes out to be about the same, and therefore when you realize that it's from a certain perspective, it's the same data sets. People drive testing will argue, well, drive testing is better because it's repeatable. Maybe that's better if you're engineering the network, but it tells you very little, for example, about what the actual consumer performance is, because 80% of the time the consumer's in a building somewhere, in a house. And the drive testing is always done on the street. So, there's pros and cons, but the basic point, if you're going to survey a mobile network, you need, the issue isn't the server, the issue is getting something on within a building or on the street to measure from that end of the network.
Hi. So I know I measure speed when either it's really, really good or really, really bad. And so what I'm wondering is
That's a theory.
okay. I'm just saying that's just me. One. But
No, I'm saying that's we've heard that. One of the reasons we have a automatic test is to avoid that. I haven't seen good data one way or the other in terms of whether or not that's true. In my case, the only time I'm interested in running a speed test only in two periods of my life. When I first get my nifty new phone, okay, and when I think things are really bad. Okay, so yes, and that's my case also. I've seen papers arguing pros and cons, both sides of the equation. So it's something we're aware of. I don't think there's a consensus on.
yeah, well, I guess you sort of answered my question, which was, can you normalize for that? Can you use statistical methods for?
We're actually hoping to do. That's one of the midterm goals we've got, because we collect the iPhone data as well as the Android data. So yeah, we do have. And by the way, even on the Android, you can do a manual test. We mark the tests whether they're automatic or manual. So yes, we're going to build a data set over time that can look at the differences between the two. There are other factors you have to consider, though. The phone type itself. So phones vary based upon performance varies based upon time of day, the type of phone, the engineering of the network. So it's not a simple problem as you might think.
I was wondering, as iPhone users, are there things we can do to make our sampling better? Like, it'd be great if the FCC app had some sort of like, once a week random. Hey, how about you test your mobile? And that's the kind of thing that I would do. I don't know if everyone would do it.
Well, we can't reach out. We can actually reach out to the consumers are anonymous, so we have no way to reach.
No, but you could insert a notification
Yes.
capability in the app that would once a week ask you to do it or something. Yeah, that's the problem. You might force people to
Yeah.
like.
Question about your automated throughput testing, actually. Do you have a lot of users who've installed the app outside of the U.S.? I'm just wondering because are data caps and other things like that a concern? I mean, they definitely are. What do you do about that, actually?
Here's what we do for data caps, okay? Here's the dirty secret of the industry is that in order to do a speed test, you have to basically consume data. And data is money in the mobile environment. We fully disclose, our terms and conditions don't protect us, they protect the consumer. So we fully disclose to the consumer what's going to happen, and that we're relying upon them to contribute a small amount of data. We also set a default setting in our app of 100 megabytes, which allows us to run 3 tests a month typically. Okay, because the test that consumes most of the data is the speed test. We make a plea that if they want to feel generous, there's a slider that they can move from 100 megabits up to 5 gigabytes, not megabits, it's megabytes, to 5 gigabytes worth of data. So in the U.S., we take some steps to ensure that everybody's protected, and we tell people we're going to consume 100 megabytes of data a month. Outside of this, we know that there are users outside. I have no personal knowledge of data plans in Iran. Or China for that matter. So we do get data from foreign countries. We really haven't had the luxury of being able to analyze foreign data. As we start publishing this data publicly, I would love to have other people take a look at it. We have, in terms of anonymization, we don't get that data, so we've got no way to know.
So you don't even know.
We don't
how
know who's
many-
doing, we don't know who's doing the test. There's no way I can distinguish your phone
Right.
from somebody else's phone.
So you just see a sample of 100 million
Right,
tests. You don't
that's
see
correct.
this phone did
That's
10.
correct.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, there are lots of things we would like to have known, but privacy trumps everything else. We actually redid our client. Our first client was very clever, but it required people to log into a portal. They could access their own data from a portal. We realized very quickly that was not the right approach. So, and by the way, when you anonymize the data, you increase the complexity of testing. Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you very much. I appreciate it.